Scholars tend to think the book of Esther is a fictional narrative set in a particular historical context and community, as stories often are. The setting of this story is the Jewish diaspora, meaning the dispersed Jewish community after the Babylonian exile. Families and established communities were forcibly moved and separated, resettling, integrating into new societies. For Jews, this narrative of exile and captivity, and then freedom and resettlement, is repeated throughout the arc of their historical and spiritual story. I'm not an expert in Judaism, but my understanding is that a significant piece of the Jewish experience is found in shared story. Like so many other group identifiers, Judaism is not a monolith, and both the religious and cultural understandings of Judaism are lived and experienced by Jews in a multitude of ways. But whether we are talking about Judaism as a world religion and great wisdom tradition, and the Jews who adhere to and practice that religion, or whether we are talking about people who identify as secular Jews and perhaps instead view Judaism as a culture, an identity, an ethnicity, my observation is that one of the foundational things that tie them together is the connection to story. Story of connectedness and community, stories of persecution and exile, stories of existential threat, and stories of coming out alive and together on the other side. And so it is that the book of Esther becomes a very good example of that story for the Jews. In fact, there is an entire holiday dedicated to it, Purim. Observed in late February or March each year, Purim includes a retelling of the story of Esther and the ultimate celebration, a joyful and maybe even a little over-the-top celebration of the outcome of the story, but greater than that, the outcome of Jewish life together, surviving and thriving after persecution. You may have noticed when Julianne read the scripture this morning from Esther chapter 2 that Esther's name was not originally Esther. Her Hebrew name was Hadassah, but we are told more than once in the book that Esther does not reveal her actual name, her identity, her heritage, her ethnicity, her culture. She takes a Persian name, Esther, which will allow her to become a candidate for the king's attention, and she says nothing of her family connections and bloodline, which we can pick up from the family names identified in her uncle Mordecai's introduction, is likely connected to King Saul. The story's antagonist, Haman, on the other hand, is introduced in chapter 3 with a genealogy that describes him as an Agagite, referring to King Agag of the Amalekites. I invite you sometime to read through 1 Samuel, particularly chapters 9 through 13, to hear more about the story of Saul and Agag. But suffice it to say that King Saul and King Agag didn't get along. And, as is often the case in literature, the main characters in the story of Esther, Mordecai, and Haman become larger than themselves. They are really representative of groups and a long-standing conflict that will come to a head. I did wonder about Hadassah, aka Esther, and the position she finds herself in, both parents deceased, cared for by Mordecai, from whom she has now become separated. The gathering of all the beautiful young women is not a gathering of volunteers. The story doesn't say whether the women wanted to be brought to the king or not, although we can imagine that, given the gender norms in this setting of ancient Persia, this opportunity could be a very positive thing, to be considered to be selected to be queen. But the reality was that a woman's life was not her own. And so the young girls were found and brought. And the next section of the story, after what we heard read today, describes that beauty treatments were implemented for a year. And then each young woman had an opportunity to go in to the king. It does not describe what happened during that meeting, but it seems unlikely that it was a formal interview process. I wonder about Hadassah Esther before she was brought to the palace, with so many unnamed young women? What stories had she heard of her mother and father, who we learn have both died? Did she have living memories or only things that she heard from Mordecai? What did he choose to tell her or not tell her? What else other than her name did Esther have to change in order to belong? What mask did she have to put on to be successful or fit into the Persian culture and community? What did she lose in the process? What parts of herself, what parts of her Hebrew culture, language, story became distant as she prepared, knowingly or unknowingly, for what will become, spoiler alert, a pivotal role in saving her people from Haman's vicious plan to destroy Mordecai and all of the Jews? Year after year, our Jewish friends celebrate Purim by completing 4 mitzvahs, or commandments from God. First is hearing the book of Esther read aloud, not just once, but twice, the whole book from a scroll, once on the evening of Purim and then again the next day. Vital storytelling that year after year reminds the people why they celebrate, reminds the people of overcoming Haman's horrific plan. The other 3 mitzvahs include charitable giving of money and food, and then enjoying a feast together in community. Year after year, repeatedly, the Jewish community tells this story amongst others. This is how they remember who they are, through telling and hearing their shared story. This is how they find strength to continue to overcome persecution and anti-Semitism. They hear the story told and remember and celebrate who they are and how they have survived. The book of Esther is not just a story about a soon-to-be queen who needed to hide her identity to become part of a desirable group of young girls in order to catch the attention of a king. This is a story about a people, an entire people, who were threatened but survived, who were persecuted but persevered. This, too, is the story of Juneteenth. Juneteenth was designated as a national holiday in 2021, the most recent. And the word is a contraction of sorts for the date June 19th. On June 19th in 1865, Army troops moved into Galveston, Texas, declaring and securing the freedom for enslaved people there who had not yet been freed, even though the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed 2 years earlier. That makes me mad now that I say it again. Dr. Jamar Tisby wrote on his Substack newsletter called Footnotes this week the following, quote, "One pattern I've noticed as people celebrate Juneteenth is the tendency to skip past slavery and rush to emancipation. Many people in the United States are quick to gloss over the unpleasantness of human bondage and simply celebrate the freedom that came afterwards. James Baldwin got it right when he said, 'It is worthwhile to point out that for most Americans, slavery is quite remote, and America herself would really prefer that we remained dispassionate about it. Well, I, for one, will never be dispassionate about slavery or any other unforgivable atrocity committed against humanity.'" Tisby continues, "You can't appreciate the joy of Juneteenth unless you understand the sorrow of slavery. I think the actual day of Juneteenth should be one of joy and exuberance. Leading up to Juneteenth, however, we should take a few minutes to remember the crushing reality of slavery. This isn't about being morbid or making a spectacle of human suffering. It is about honoring the history, the full history of Black freedom by recognizing the bondage that prevented it for so long." End quote. And Tisby goes on to tell stories. The story of Ulauda Ikoyano, who was stolen into slavery from Nigeria and later wrote his autobiography, which includes descriptions of the holding pens and the excrement tubs and the emotional separation from his sister, whom he never saw again. The story of Harriet Jacobs, who wrote in her autobiography the story of the peril particularly faced by Black young women and girls, forced to make choices between terrible options, including rape or a teenage relationship with a white man in town. The story of Frederick Douglass, who wrote in his autobiography of the horrific glee a particular enslaver found in whipping a Black enslaved woman. And I am lightening up the stories as I share them with you now. These particular stories are written by people with known names. But how many other stories might there be? Never recorded, unnamed, lives swept away by the waves of time and power and privilege and pain. Tisby writes, "To fully appreciate the progress that Juneteenth represents, we also have to sit with the reality of the slavery that made it necessary. The horrific history of enslavement must be named, acknowledged, the stories told and retold and heard, particularly by white people, and lamented. Then the news of emancipation can be recognized, celebrated, commemorated. And still, what masks do our Black and brown siblings feel like they need to wear? What other names do they feel like they need to use in order to be seen as though they belong?" Purim celebrates after it remembers, after it laments, after it sits in it. At the end of Esther chapter 3, the news is released that an order has been made to wipe out, kill, and destroy all the Jews, both young and old, even women and little children, in one day. And then at the beginning of chapter 4, Mordecai sits in ashes, mourning, lamenting, realizing, fearing, dreading. Threat of extermination has been a repeated and real part of the Jewish story. And Purim both remembers and acknowledges that story and celebrates an outcome of continuity and gathered community. So, too, for our Black friends and neighbors, is Juneteenth a recognition of a past and continued struggle against oppression and marginalization, and a commemoration of a day of progress. Last week, we had some moments of individual lament for personal experiences of pain and loss and bitterness. This morning, perhaps we might sit for a moment in corporate lament. Lament for the difficulty we have in authentically welcoming and opening ourselves, our groups, our institutions, our hearts to those of diverse racial and cultural and ethnic backgrounds, particularly those who live right in our Elizabethtown community or the communities where we work and live and go to school and vacation. So I invite you to pause for just a moment and consider who around us finds they need to melt into a different identity, use a different name, hide their heritage or background, and why. Do we notice? And what do we do about it? Let the stories that we hear and the stories that we know of named and unnamed persons, stories that we tell and retell, let us hear them again. Not because we forget, but because we remember. And in remembering, we put together pieces of who we are, who others are, in ways that foster dignity, justice, and belonging. We tell stories. We commemorate important events on special set-apart days because the stories need to be told and heard, and the days need to be remembered for such a time as this. May it be so.